Hey everybody, welcome back to the Driven Leadership Podcast. We are so excited about today's episode. I personally am so excited about today's episode because we have Dr. Ralph Kilmann on the show. For those of you who did listen to our Conflict Effective episode from a few weeks ago, you'll recognize this name. Dr. Kilmann, along with Ken Thomas, developed the TKI instrument, which is the tool that we use at Driven to train companies how to be conflict effective. Dr. Kilmann has been studying conflict since the 1960s, and like Eric said in that episode, is how we describe the Einstein of conflict. We are just honored and so privileged to have Dr. Kilmann on the show, as he describes in the podcast. He doesn't really do podcasts anymore, but he was gracious enough to come on and talk about his history, his legacy, and his vision for how teams, organizations, and individuals can become conflict effective and manage conflict within their teams and within themselves. So we don't want to waste any more time. We're going to jump in to this exciting episode. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Dr. Ralph Kilmann.
I am so excited to introduce Ralph Kilmann in today's podcast session. Not just introduce, I've looked at Ralph as being one of our mentors, teachers, friend, and how things happen. You know, some people have heard me say there's no such thing as a coincidence, and everything that we do creates a ripple effect. So years ago, we were looking at putting a conflict or a communication class together. We wanted conflict in it, and we're doing this research on conflict, and TKI, Kilmann Diagnostics keeps showing up, and I'm like, this is interesting. So I get on your website, download it, take it, go to get certified, and I have no idea. I'm still lost. And so Eric finds you like a beta class in Victoria, Canada, and said, hey, you need to go. So Amber, my daughter, and I head out to this class, and we sit at this table, and lo and behold, we are sitting with the Ralph Kilmann. Still had no idea who you were and how big of a deal it was. And to learn from you, to glean all this knowledge, like you made that class fun. Fast forward, we're with one of our biggest clients, and he says, how do you know Ralph Kilmann? He's on LinkedIn, sees that we're connected. And we end up in your house, Camelot, learning from you. And that was what, 2018? Yeah, 2017, 18.
Something like that.
And we got about legacy. We talked about legacy, just to sit and glean and learn from you. We talk about you being the Einstein of conflict, and not just the Einstein of conflict, to be able to work alongside of you. When I say you're our mentor, you're our teacher, you are one of the most authentic, transparent, real. You're feisty, you're fun, you're energetic, and you have such just your brand in life is to leave this world a better place. And I know you don't do podcasts anymore. And when I asked and you said, yes, I'm over the moon ecstatic. So I just want to say thank you for being here.
My pleasure, Mary, and thank you for your very kind words. I almost have to blush when I hear them.
Well, it means the world. Amber and Amber always says, please tell Ralph hi. So as you know, we get in here and just, you know, conflict is such a large topic. And knowing some listeners know the history, some people have no idea. They just know conflict is a big thing. I would love to hear your story. How did you ever get involved in this? How did it start?
Well, that is a very good question. I've had to reflect on that many times. And when I look back, I have to assume that my parents' story, coming from Nazi Germany in the 1930s over to the United States, my mother was Jewish, my father Protestant. That certainly led to a huge conflict in Germany and ultimately contributed to World War II. So I was born in 1946, right after World War II. So that conflict was still very much present and a lot of awareness in the present culture. And I have to assume that mega conflict had a background for me to always look at what do you do when there's such fundamental differences in society? Do you go to war, or are there other alternatives? So that was always there. And then when I went to my undergraduate college, Carnegie Mellon University, in the 1960s, there were a few professors who just happened to be researching on organizational conflict and group conflict. A person like Lou Pondy wrote several articles in the 60s on organizational conflict, one of the first. And Herb Simon worked on group conflict. He later got a Nobel Prize in economics, so I had good instruction at Carnegie Mellon. So that, again, was a further introduction to the concept of conflict that added to that background from my parents coming from Germany. And then in 1970, I went to UCLA, and that's where I met Ken Thomas. And he was working on his dissertation on conflict management, particularly departmental conflict. And Ken and I just clicked. I've often said he and I would have been great friends even if we weren't working on the same topic. We just had a good connection, and we've stayed great friends for the last 50 plus years. So that's how it really began, from my family heritage, being exposed to conflict at Carnegie Mellon, and then meeting Ken Thomas.
Isn't it amazing how in our lives, when we have adversity, when we have challenges, we can grow from it? And it actually, a lot of times, our why, our passion stirs from that place.
Absolutely. In fact, a lot of times people are still afraid of conflict. They don't like conflict. They want it to go away. They never want to have conflict again. And yet I often have to remind people that conflict is also the source of ultimate creativity, growth, enhancement, achievement. It gets you to look at things in new ways, especially if you have good communication with people that you have differences with. So it's a powerful fuel for doing things better and better year after year. But if you shy away from conflict, you don't have that opportunity to grow.
I remember you saying that in the 2-day class that we took. You said people, their whole thing is they want it to go away. And it's not about going away. It truly is, how do you manage it effectively? And it changed my paradigm, because I used to think as well, it's like, how do we just not, we're going to resolve it. We need it to go away. And it's not good or bad. That was another thing you taught me, is that conflict isn't good or bad. It's what we deem it as. Like, we're the ones that put that label on it.
Yeah. And conflict is a troublesome word for the reasons that people have been hurt by it. But it might be interesting to know that when Ken and I first put a title on our instrument, it was simply called the MODE instrument. MODE being management of differences exercise. We didn't use the word conflict. We just focused on differences. And I have found that when you tell people, oh, we have differences we need to discuss, it's not as challenging as saying, oh, we have a conflict, which has all those negative connotations. So that's something to keep in mind. But then when we got the instrument published, the publisher actually said, well, conflict is a hot topic, and it captures attention more than the word differences. When you say conflict, people look up and say, oh, what's that about? I've felt that before. So I think it became as much a marketing decision to put the name conflict on the TKI.
That's really interesting, because as I've been in Driven and we've done online trainings with conflict, we hear a lot of people within teams say, oh, well, we don't have conflict. We don't have these big blowout arguments. So we don't need to know how to manage conflict. We just need to know how to work better as a team. So, and you've already alluded to it, but I would be really fascinated to know, how do you, Dr. Kilmann, define what conflict truly means in organizations or groups?
At the base level, conflict, as I said, is about differences. And if you remove the word conflict for a moment, it's less challenging to say, because we grew up differently, we have different aspirations, different goals, went to different schools, live in different neighborhoods, maybe even have a different language, there's going to be differences. And with all the talk about globalization and diversity in the workplace, there's going to be more and more differences. With challenging problems, fast-paced change, you're going to have differences. Those need to be managed. So anyone who says there's no such thing as conflict, or I don't have any conflict, they're not alive. They're living in a dream world. All you have to focus on Do I have different opinions and approaches than the other people in my household, in my workplace, on the street, in a store? That's a conflict.
It's a different
We have
paradigm
people,
shift.
right? To Connor's point, we have people that go, "No, we don't have conflict. We never have conflict." I'm like, "You're the one that creates the conflict." Yeah. So I'm curious, going back into 1970 when you and Ken sat down with this, did you have any idea that it would get as big as it is?
Not a clue is the short answer. The longer answer is when we finished doing our research, and we were both at UCLA, and that's a research environment. So we created the TKI for research purposes. We were studying it, collecting data, comparing it to some of the other instruments that had been already developed in the 1960s. And as a result of that discussion, we said, let's put the instrument at the end of the article in the appendix in a research journal. That's the way it's usually done. So you put it there, and then researchers can copy it and make use of their research, and that's the end of story. But Ken and I, we were young, we had these egos, okay? And we said, well, maybe this could become really popular. We were very familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, and that had had tremendous success going around the world, being used in so many different languages. So Ken and I, these young assistant professors and doctoral students, we said, wait, maybe we could do something like that too. And so we have to find a publisher. Well, Ken went to one of the marketing professors at UCLA and asked, do you think we should put it at the back of the journal in the appendix, or we should try to publish it and make a major instrument that practitioners can use? And the professor said, don't be ridiculous. No one's going to buy this. Just put it at the end of your article and be done with it.
Like everybody else.
Now, thank God for egos, because Ken and I were not ready to live with that. So we decided, no, we're going to try to get it published. And we eventually found this company, Zycom, in New York, and they're the ones who were very interested in publishing it. And they're the ones who put the name Conflict on it. But what's also they did, they put our names on it. Ken and I never conceived of the Thomas-Kilmann Instrument. The publisher suggested that. But can you imagine? As soon as the publisher suggested that, Ken and I said, wow, that's great. That's just like the names Myers-Briggs. We're going to be famous, But to answer the question on how did we really know, or when did we really discover that it was going to have the impact we were dreaming about or hoping for? And the best response to that is our royalty payments quarter after quarter after quarter. And then starting in the early 70s, each quarter the royalties got higher, higher, higher. It didn't matter what was going on in the economy. In the 70s, late 70s, there was an oil recession, gas prices, on and on. Well, still the sales of the TKI was going higher and higher. So that told us something was going on. And eventually we heard from one customer who said, if you tried to hide the TKI and put it under a rock, people would find it. That's how popular it became.
Wow. And then you ended up selling the rights to Myers-Briggs.
Well, what's interesting, in around 1999, it turned out that one of the leading people in Zycom passed away, and the rest of the family didn't want to keep the business going. He was the only one interested in that publishing business. And so they decided to sell it. And they brought us into the process. And to make a long story short, the Myers-Briggs company, at that time called CPP, decided to take it on. And again, as you can imagine, Ken and I were thrilled that the same publisher that does the Myers-Briggs type indicator was also publishing the TKI. So the MBTI, is, if you think about it, is focused on appreciating differences, recognizing differences, and then the TKI is about managing those differences.
This is so good. I love what you said. Thank God for the ego, because there is a piece, and I'm such a huge believer in when people have a dream, that there's a reason why there are ideas and dreams that just swirl in us, because we're the ones that are to bring it to life or to start the process. And so many people get afraid of trusting their ideas or to putting it out there. Well, who am I? Well, who are we not to be? Right?
Yeah.
Well,
what was fascinating is if you think back about the early 1970s when Ken and I did this work on the TKI, there was very little mainstream interest in conflict. You hardly heard the word. I mean, if
Mm.
you said it, people would know what it is, they'd react to it. But for the most part, people weren't learning about conflict management. It wasn't in courses. They may have been mentioned a little bit in political science, maybe in sociology, but that's about it. I have to say, Ken and I could not have anticipated that 30, 40 years later, that the term conflict and the diversity and the divisions and the polarizations, the wars that are going on, are so ripe for discussing how do we manage these differences at the interpersonal level all the way to the international level. So I'd like to say we anticipated that. If we did, it was pure intuition. We had no evidence that the world would change in the way it did.
Wow.
Mm.
Okay, so for the listeners who have no idea what the TKI is, would you give them a quick summary on what it is?
Okay, I'd be happy to. Of course, the TKI stands for the Thomas-Kilmann Instrument. It has 30 A-B choice items that represent different ways of resolving a conflict. The instructions are: consider situations in which your wishes differ from those of another person. How do you usually respond to those differences? And of course, we're trying to measure those 5 conflict modes: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And people then do those A-B choices to say, do I prefer to split the difference, or do I want to have a thorough discussion? Do I find it better to walk away from the situation and avoid useless tensions, or do I need to give in to the other person? So all the choices of among the 5 conflict modes you have to choose on this instrument, and then it assesses which modes you might be using too much or too little. So some people, the first time they take the TKI, they come out as high on competing, as if
Mm.
I'm always right. I always know more than the other person. I'm going to get my way. I'm going to
That's
assert
me.
myself. I'm going to win. And then you say, well, and their lowest mode is avoiding. They figure they always have to get their way. Even when they're playing the game of Monopoly, they have to win no matter what. That's competing. Well, there are those extremes from the other 5 modes. But once you get results, you say, is that mode that I'm using most of the time best for me and other people in all situations?
Mm.
Might I be more versatile and responsive if I have a behavioral repertoire that I can choose any one of those 5 modes depending on what would work best in that situation? That is learning about how to manage conflict and differences more effectively. So instead of using one mode all the time and not using other modes, you can then use all 5 depending on the situation. The more choice you have, the more effective you could be across a wide variety of settings.
Yeah, and I love that it's a choice. It's not like you take the assessment and this is your personality. It is no, here's an awareness. Here are options. Now, as you get understanding how to read the situation, which one should or could I use?
Yeah, what's very important to know about the TKI, it does not measure a stable personality disposition like the MBTI. It
Mm.
measures behavior. So what happens is sometimes, like on a Friday before a workshop, people take the TKI, they find out they come out especially high on 1 or 2 modes, low on others. And then there's workshop exercises, discussions. People can role play. People can try out what's it like to use the different modes. And then on Sunday evening, after the 3-day workshop, they take the TKI again, and lo and behold, they come out differently because their behavior has changed. So that's what's fascinating. You can change your behavior and how you approach conflict in a weekend, and the
Mm.
TKI would register that. That makes it very different from the kind of MBTI and other personality instruments that try to capture how are you typically day after day after day, and sometimes you never change from that characteristic style. That's very different than what we assess with the TKI.
I love, and you know the story. Some people know the story, but when Eric and I got into this and we got certified and all this, his avoiding was so low. It was like a 3. And he always believed that you had to address the conflict and you had to solve it right there. And I said, no, Ralph says it's okay to avoid at times. And so we have this, it's like a joke. And now he's actually gotten better and it's gone up because yes, there's times that we have to avoid. Sometimes we need to compete. And
There's a
I
place
love the
for
teach. Yeah.
every mode, depending on the situation. And that tells you people to learn conflict management, they learn to read the situation. What is the level of stress? How important is this issue for me as opposed to the other person? Do we have good communication skills? Do we trust one another? Are we willing to say what we really need or want, or do we keep it close to the vest? Does the reward system support people openly discussing their conflicts? Or if I approach this conflict, am I going to hear about it in a negative way on my performance review? So these are all situational factors which affect which conflict mode is most likely to satisfy your needs and other people's needs in a given situation.
So you've worked with so many different companies where they brought you in. You worked with the United Nations, right? You also worked at the White House at one time. They brought you in to help manage conflict. How did that work? What
Well,
were
it's
some of the successes and some of the not so successful
Well, the
times?
biggest challenges to effective conflict management is when the behavioral infrastructure of the company does not support an open discussion of differences. And
Mm.
that, when I think about the behavioral infrastructure, I'm talking about cultural norms, the skills people have to interact with one another, and the level of teamwork. Can people work with diverse others, or they have difficulty cooperating as a team? That's the behavioral infrastructure. And when companies have trouble with conflict and differences, it's because the culture, number one, has norms like don't bring the issues out in the open. No one wants to hear about it. You're going to get a negative performance review if you stir up the bee's nest. Just keep things to yourself. It's not worth it. Keep yourself low. Keep your eyes down. Don't disagree with the boss. Don't step on the toes of senior management. On and on. That kind of avoiding culture, I call it, prevents any important differences from being voiced, addressed, and resolved. And then skills. Do people have the skills to manage conflict? Well, guess what? In most high schools, colleges, universities, there aren't any courses on how do you manage conflict. No, there aren't. So where do you learn it? That's why there's so many training programs that make up for what we didn't get behaviorally in our colleges and universities, where we
Mm.
teach largely cognitive topics, not
Mm.
behavioral subjects. People don't learn how to behave better in situations in college and universities. They get cognitive knowledge about facts and theories and methods and things like that. So it's most important to realize that once we build that infrastructure of culture, we have to provide the skills that they never got before in colleges and universities. How do you read the situation? How do you role play and try out different conflict modes? What are the different ways to enact the conflict mode? For example, I can compete by shouting and slamming my fist on the table and saying, you have to follow what I'm saying, otherwise you're going to hear about it later. Or I can say, let me share with you why this is so important to me. And maybe you can help me so that I can get my needs met on this particular issue. I really need your help. Two totally different approaches to competing. So every mode can be used in a way that engages the other person to contribute or pushes them away. So we have to learn in the skills track how to approach differences in a productive, compassionate, effective manner, not to push people away into corners where no dialogue takes place. And then with teamwork, of course, we have to be able to discuss it not just with two people, but with a whole group, because most organizations are organized into departments, teams, divisions, and so forth. So that has to be built into the organization. And what's interesting too, there are companies that offer a lot of training programs in conflict management, but they hold them in safe workshop settings away from work. And then after everything is learned, the participants go back to the organization and their boss tells them, get back to work. And they say, oh, but I learned all this cool stuff about managing differences that could really help us. I don't want to hear about it now. Get back to work. So a big issue is regardless of what a company has invested in training programs, safe workshops, I call them, companies spend millions and billions in dollars in total on these training programs. But how much of what is learned in that safe workshop setting gets used in the organization if the culture doesn't support it? So you need a program that prepares the organization, its culture, the skills of its members, and the teamwork to apply conflict management effectively on the job in the workplace where it counts.
That what you're saying goes into that study that actually you shared with me, where Stanford did that study on CEOs, and the number one area of concern was how to manage conflict.
Yes.
And I look at that and I see it all the time because we're in the leadership training world, and people want that quick fix. They just want, give us the quick fix. And it's like magic, but it's not magic.
Yeah.
It's underneath. You have to identify truly what's going on.
Well, back in 1984, you may or may not remember, we didn't know each other then, but I published a book called Beyond the Quick Fix.
Mm-hmm.
And that focused on getting away from the tendency to think, oh, one workshop will give to all employees, then they'll know how to manage conflict better in the workplace. It just doesn't happen like that. We not only have to learn it, most importantly, we have to transfer what is learned back into the workplace. That is called the transfer of learning problem. Huge. If we don't do that, the employees may benefit in their home life from what they've learned, but the company who's paying for it doesn't benefit. So we have to turn that around. So to move away from the quick fix, that's why I created these various tracks, 8 tracks in total, to gradually but systematically and effectively move the organization through a transformational process where people can really do things differently in the workplace and get rewarded for it, get appreciated for it, and be more effective.
So what would be the first step? I know the 8 tracks, yet there's people like, I don't have this kind of time. And I really need to fix and work on my culture. And they're like, I need conflict training.
Yeah.
What would you do? How would you work with someone first? What would be your suggestion?
Well, I first tell them the story of a non-quick fix. And it's a story. I did a program for a top executive group in Philadelphia many years ago. I will never forget it. It's etched in my mind. And I walked them through 3 days of these 8-track programs, showing them what is the difference between that and the quick fix. 3 whole days so they could see why a sequence of change initiatives done in the right order, done effectively, done with time, done with patience, can be effective in changing the organization as opposed to the quick fix. After the 3rd day, I'll never forget this, the CFO, who was in the back of the room, raised his hand and said, I finally figured out what you've created here, Dr. Kilmann. What you have here is a quick fix. And I said, what? I said, have you not been paid? This is what I was going on inside of me. I was saying, how long does it take for them to get it? Why does he not understand this? But I didn't say that. I simply said, can you tell me more about what you just said? I'm not sure I fully understand it. And he said, I'll be glad to tell you. I've been in this company for 20 years now. I've seen us go through MBO, team building, leadership training, communication, matrix organizations, quality management, whatever you call it, we've done it. And nothing has really changed. We still put one another down. We still resent one another. Departments don't cooperate. They pretend they're in different organizations, and on, the same thing again and again. And we've been doing this for 20 years. We've been spinning our wheels. And now you're telling me, by following a carefully designed sequence of 8 tracks, we can do this in 2 years? My goodness, that's a quick fix compared to what we've been through for the last 20.
That's hilarious.
So decide, do you want to spend 20 years going through one quick fix after another without success? Or do you want to finally say, let's do it right from the start. Let's do it with patience, in sequence, and do what's necessary to first change the behavioral infrastructure before we revisit strategy, structure, and reward systems again.
So what happens if you don't have leadership that buys in? Because we see this a lot where people are like, go fix my company, fix my managers, and they're not doing the work. So what would you say?
Well, in my program, I have these 5 stages of transformation. The first stage is initiating the program and gaining and marshaling senior management support. Typically, if senior management is not on board and leading the effort, it's not going anywhere. It's up to departments to try to improve things, but then that's only one department. They may still not be working effectively with other departments. So how do you address that? You need senior support from the top to make this happen. I remember one case in a company where the senior executives were having this meeting and the board of directors were there, and they were saying, we can't go on with this program. It's taking too long. It's too expensive. We have our work to do. We got to stop this. Let's go back to business as usual. And the CEO said, after he heard all these comments, I heard what you said. What you're telling me is we have to proceed with this program no matter what. And the executives and the board, they looked at it. That's not what we said. But this CEO had the clout, the strength, the fortitude to say, we're doing this no matter what, because I don't want 20 years, another 20 years of quick fixes. I want to get it right now. And we proceeded, and the implementation, in my view, what I experienced was very effective, very effective. Wow. But it had to be supported by senior management. Next, you have to do a diagnosis. You have to get to the root cause. And typically what I would do when I was involved in these programs, I would randomly separate a number of people and have one-on-one interviews throughout the organization. At every level, every area, every division, every department, I would have a randomized sample. So for an organization of 5,000, I might interview about 150 people. Based on the law of large numbers, if you do a random stratified sample, you can get a good reading of the organization with that sampling. And in those interviews, you say, what helps you get your work done? What gets in the way? What do you like? What makes you frustrated? What gives you satisfaction? Tell us what goes on here. And based on all those interviews, you find out the role of the culture, the skills, the teams, the strategy structure. Do people understand the goal, the focus? Does the reward system work, or is it rewarding behavior from the past? So you do that diagnosis. And based on that thorough diagnosis, you then schedule the 8 tracks in some form so that the organization can create the infrastructure and the formal systems to move forward and address all its differences, its conflicts, and its problems.
When you created the TKI, did you ever think that there was a bigger picture, or was it just, here's the assessment, we're going to help people know that they have a choice within their behavior? Or was there something that was always in the back of your mind going, we can do this, but there has to be something more?
Well, as it turns out, Mary, I would say the major focus of all my work is transformation and change management. Conflict management is a part of that, but it's not like I did conflict management and then found a way to weave in change management. I really started with change management when I was at Carnegie Mellon, continued that at UCLA. Of course, I had this very important theme of conflict management, but conflict and change go hand in hand. In fact, I have articles that talk about conflict and change as being 2 sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. When you resolve a conflict, change takes place. When change takes place, you can bet there's going to be conflict because it throws people's differences into the limelight. So basically, that's what goes on. It's like you have to do both of them. For me, the bigger picture is change management. And part of that, of course, is so we can effectively manage all our conflicts and problems.
Do you believe that one person, if they're a champion within the organization and they go through things like this and the culture doesn't buy in, so to speak, but you have someone that is still doing the work, that they can influence and help work or change within their departments? Because when we work with large companies, we work with small companies, we work with different sizes of teams, and I'll see sometimes large companies that the leadership doesn't buy in. They don't have and maybe they don't think they can, but they have small pods of teams where the leader within the team absolutely gets it, and they create transformation within that pod.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I call that micro organizational change, but it is organizational change nonetheless. And that's the case where you have, let's call him or her an enlightened manager. They're in a department or work group that's far removed from the senior executive levels, but they're enthusiastic, they're exciting about doing things better, improving things, and given the resources they have available to them, the time, the clout, the authority, they put in place some changes in the culture and the systems. However, that still makes it difficult to cooperate with other teams who don't go through that process. But what's interesting, I've had workshop settings where I've had, oh my goodness, a couple of hundred people in one workshop room coming from different departments in the organization. And after they've been working on some of these issues, I ask them to report, how are things going? What are you doing? There's a group. There's always a group. God bless them. I want to stand up and give each of them a kiss. They actually present and say what they're doing. They've changed the culture, the skills, how they communicate, how they resolve conflict. And the other groups and departments look at them and say, you can't do that here. What made you think you can do that here? Well, they're doing it. And of course, then it raises the question, if one group and one department can do it, why can't the rest? That really raises the question. Ironically, sometimes the groups would prefer that one group does not make a presentation of how well they're doing, so it takes the pressure off all the other groups to change and improve. But I'm telling you, when that one group stands up and talks about how they've embraced the material and what they're doing, oh my goodness, you say, thank God they're setting an example for the rest of the organization.
Raising the bar. Yeah.
How have you seen conflict change over the years? So you started this 1970s where all the work started to come. How has it changed?
Well, I'll tell you how it's changed for me, because I, like many others, was initially focusing on conflicts out there between two people, between two departments, between two organizations, between people in a relationship, between children, between kids in the neighborhood. It's always out there somewhere, regardless of the setting. And then as I've developed as a person, I realized that the ultimate source of all our outside conflicts are our inside conflicts. And if we don't look at and address our inside conflicts, we're going to continue acting them out on other people outside. And so I indicated 4 kinds of inner conflicts that if you address them, you're going to have a much easier time managing differences with other people and other organizations. So for me, it's like saying we can use the same conflict modes to address questions like, what do I follow, my ego or my soul? Is it one or the other, or can I do both? How do I get them both on the same page? How do I develop a collaborative solution between my ego and soul? Or are they always going to be at war, where the ego wants fame and mortality and immortality, and the soul wants to contribute something important to society? How do we reconcile that? Well, do we avoid it and never even consider it? It's no discussion. We just avoid it. Or do we compete so the ego wins over the soul, or the soul wins over the ego? On and on. The same 5 conflict modes play out on the inside as they do on the outside. So I have found that valuable, because a major theme in my recent work, as you know, is expanding consciousness so that people are more aware of themselves and others in making all kinds of decisions and approaching all kinds of problems.
Wow. I'm so glad you shared that, because now you fast tracked. I probably could have gotten there, like yourself, years and years into teaching and managing conflict. But that is fascinating, to flip the script back on yourself and apply the same modes in the same way with the contrasting views within your own humanity.
In fact, in my
incredible.
recent books, I actually use the TKI model explicitly to show the integration and the discussion of ego versus soul, physical body versus energy body, primal relationships being addressed or not, and other things like that. And then we can use those 5 modes, and then we can become healthier individuals, and then we can work more effectively with other people. The worst case is when you don't know yourself and you have these internal conflicts, you are doomed to act them out on other people. Unconsciously, not purposely, but you just act it out on other people because you haven't resolved it inside yourself. That's what I've learned in life.
That's so powerful. And like, to Connor, I'm like, it's so true. And we look at, people are always wanting to do it outside. They want to solve it outside. They want to address it and fix it outside. But if they're not doing the inside work, if they're not looking at their part or why, they're going to recreate it. We see that, just generation, right? The gap, like, it just keeps going.
Yeah.
So what's an easy way? So if I was teaching a kid, a teenager, to look at, because sometimes, ego and soul, how would you put that in layman's term where somebody would go, oh, okay, this is what he means. This is how I could do this.
Well, certainly educational systems can decide to have material other than just math and science and English and history, and really talk about human development and how people can become happy and healthy over their lifetime, that is a subject of importance besides the usual math and English scores. That can be introduced into schools. In fact, in one of my books, I talk about how the educational system can be revised so our citizens become healthier, choiceful, more mindful, and learn more about the world in which they live. But that always starts from inner knowledge before we worry about trying to interpret outer knowledge. So that's very important. Now, for organizations, I have found there are many cultural norms in organizations that say, do not talk about yourself.
Yeah.
Do not talk about those inner issues. That's private. Keep it to yourself. Meanwhile, they keep acting out nonsense. They don't work effectively with one another. They put one another down. They don't respond to requests from other departments. They don't realize they're on the same team in the same organization. They just happen to be in a different department. And as a result of that, they have to become more aware of what they are contributing to that. And in those organizations that I've worked with, and sometimes I visit them, and they're already doing it, they talk about mindfulness. They talk about consciousness. They're actually talking about these things. See, very beginning, back in the 1800s, the only thing people brought into the organization were their hands for hire, physical labor. That's it.
Yeah.
We don't want your mind. We just want physical labor, your hands. Then with the movement in the 1930s, with the Roethlisberger and others about social behavior in the workplace, we realized that people also have social needs. They want to interact with one another. They even develop connections and friendships on the job. That's important to them. They are social beings. And then they became cognitive beings in the 1960s. And then they became computer beings. And now we have enhancement with AI. So people are bringing more and more of themselves into the workplace. And some people are suggesting, why not, besides hands and social activity, what about mind, body, spirit? Isn't that the essence of who we are? What creativity is possible if mind, body, spirit energy is released and people can work together with that spirit, that energy, that excitement, that enthusiasm, as opposed to, I'm only here to do physical labor.
Yeah.
And in some companies, it's not much more than that. Okay, they focus on the bottom line, the profit line, and they don't always develop their people. But the organizations, I believe, are going to be successful long run, where they realize it's not either or. You don't have either profit or you have a humane society. Why can't you have both? It's not either or. Again, that's the conflict model. So instead of win-lose, let's do a win-win for a change.
Talking about, because we get this a lot of times with compromise and collaborating. And I think about companies and teams where they're doing things, they're working hard, they want to solve, but you have one outlier, and everything that you do, there's this one person that refuses to buy in. How would you, and you have to solve it, you have to work through it, but this one person won't participate? How do you handle that?
Well, assuming that person is in a group, the typical process is using group pressure. Groups do this all the time. In fact, typically, if you don't go along with the group norm, you get ostracized, ignored, ultimately you're abandoned, okay? Because groups have strict guidelines on, if you want to be us, you want to be a member here, this is how we do things. You're going to be part of the group, whether it's a sports team or a team in a workplace, we have to be together. And the military is supreme with this. They come up with sanctioning systems where if you're not in line, you're going to get a lot of grief from your fellow members in the military group. So they use a lot of social pressure. So if you marshal that kind of social pressure, usually people will go along. Otherwise, they might say, I don't want to be a member of this group anymore because it's not aligned with how I want to go about things. And ultimately that filters out. But as long as the group pressure, this is very important, is applied towards what is effective and efficient and adaptable for the organization, we're fine. We just don't want that social pressure keeping people down, avoiding conflicts, avoiding problems. So the social pressure can say, you better keep things to yourself and don't speak up about our differences. Or the social pressure can say, we have to speak up about what we see, what we know, what we can do, because these are important problems that are facing the organization and we want to succeed.
You know, it's interesting because I've seen it both ways, where the social pressure helps fold that person in. They buy in, or they find another place, that they get to be brilliant in. But I've also seen where that one person influences the group. So I actually it was a conflict class, and everyone was open, like 100%. They're just sharing, they're being open, except for the one person that they were hoping that the class would help create some dialogue and openness. and this person refused, and it put a damper on everyone. So how would you handle that?
I would create an exercise or a discussion that asks people to talk about what does it feel like when one person is opposing everything that's going on, which seems to be what would help the organization move forward. What might be going on there? How do we manage that? Make it a group discussion. And then see what the person says about what is the importance. Sometimes maybe it's good to have an alternate point of view that doesn't go along, as long as it's being done respectfully and the person shares their reasons, not just adamant says, I don't want to talk about it. That's the way I am. That's just the way it is. So as long as you can support a conversation about why is one or two people seeing it differently, that's fine. And then that can work well under that umbrella. But if there's no communication, there's no discussion, you're not going to be able to move forward. Just like with anything else, you've got to be able to talk about it. Otherwise, you can't do anything about it.
Right. Well, it was so interesting because this person was engaged, but every time I'd ask for their, where they're at, if they felt comfortable, everything was opposite of what I had in front of me because I had their information. I was like, wow. So it ends up, there's not trust in the organization. There's not feeling safe and heard. And I look at organizations and people, and it's perception, right? There is a perception going on. And how do you work and help open that person to realize, man, I'm on your team?
Well, I also have a separate track that's behind the scenes, and the label isn't a good one, but I often refer to it as the troublemaking track. And that is typically for
that one.
people, not just who disagree, but to disagree in a very dysfunctional manner. People who intimidate others, who bully, who yell, who scream, who threaten, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Yes, this goes on in organizations. And so the question becomes, how do we address that? And these represent, in some cases, some mental health issues. And some organizations are realizing that some individuals need a little counseling. They're not aware of their behavior or the impact it's having on others. And they don't realize that this has derailed them in the past, in different groups, in different organizations. Well, maybe you can give them an opportunity to learn something about themselves. So there are employee counseling, employee assistance programs in organizations that are designed for this, because there are always some individuals who are troubled or going through some transition, who are going through some illness, and they sometimes act this out in the workplace. They don't cooperate because they're angry about what's going on. Who knows? There can be all kinds of reasons. But again, bringing it to the attention and helping the person, giving some support so that person can discuss the issues. Maybe that person can then change their life around, not just come to the workplace, but have a different life at home as well.
Well, I always talk about seeking to understand, because a lot of times what happens in the workforce, it doesn't necessarily mean it has anything to do with work. A lot of times it has to do things within their personal life, and they just, because you're at work all the time, and it might be a place where they feel safer to act out or not.
It is human nature that whatever your unresolved issues are, your frustrations, traumas from past life, and welcome to the human race. Everyone has traumas. Everyone. I take that as a given. Just like some people say, I've never had conflict, they also sometimes say, I've never had a trauma. Well, welcome to the human race. Everyone has trauma. And the only question is, in what ways does that get acted out if you don't understand it? And I have found the hard way, I had to learn this about my own life, that whatever traumas you have, the more you get in touch with them, then the more you can catch it, and then you don't get triggered, and you don't act it out on other people. But picture a situation, a work group, where everyone in the group is acting out some trauma from the past. It's no wonder they can't get anything done. They're all using that stage, that work group, as a projection screen on what wasn't resolved in the past. They yell at one another, they disagree, they don't explain the reasons, they don't cooperate, they don't follow through on what they promised because this was done to them in the past, and they're mad. So if that goes on, then nothing can happen productively in the organization. So I've had to have discussions in organizations on what has been the traumas. Let's look at it, but let's say, what are the norms here? How will we behave towards one another so we can truly be effective and efficient?
I love you have a process where you talk about actual norms and desired norms, and then how to bridge that gap.
Right. That's in the culture track. And some people talk about culture as values, ideologies, philosophies. To me, that's all abstract. People keep talking about it, but they don't do anything. When you talk about actual norms in the workplace, you're saying, what really goes on here? How do we get things done? How do we survive? What are the rules of the road? And then that's when people, and you give them some examples, and they say things like, well, the norms are don't come to meetings on time because you want to be perceived as important, and important people come late. Don't give information to the other group. They let us down in the past. We're still angry with them. Don't get caught sharing information. Otherwise, you're going to be ostracized. And as I mentioned before, don't disagree with the boss. You're going to hear about it later in your performance review. Be careful what you say. It can and will be used against you. Well, with norms like that, you're not going to have many open conversations in the company. Then you say, well, what are the desired norms? If we were really interested and sincere about being better and improving, what would the norms be? Be candid, share information, let people know what you know, bring that into the conversation. Don't avoid important conflicts. We have to address it for the benefit of this organization. Share information with other groups. We're on the same team. We're working in the same organization. And then you look at the gap between the actual norms and the desired norms. And in many cases, it's huge. Then we talk about how do we close the gap? And usually we have a sanctioning system. People agree we're going to close the gap. What happens the next time someone walks into a meeting late? Do you just ignore it? Or the first sanction is everyone looks at their watch, looks at the person, looks at their watch, looks at the person. Oh, okay, I get it, late. It won't happen again. Next time it happens, they maybe they lock the door so the person can't come in. Or they actually, I've had this with executives. The person who's late has to sit in the corner of the room, facing the corner during the group meeting.
Oh my gosh.
I suggest coming up with sanctions that are legal and ethical, but they have to be effective. And you know what the participants learn? If there isn't a consequence for doing something different, why would anyone want to change?
Right.
There must be a consequence. It doesn't have to be brutal. It doesn't have to be harsh, but you have to bring person's attention to the fact that an old cultural norm was enacted again, and that's not what we agreed to do for the future. And then every month you have a progress report in the workplace. What have I done differently since this program began? And I write it out and I share it. And then some other people say, well, you may have thought about doing that. Maybe you intended to do, but we've just seen the same old behavior. So what people learn in an organization, that transfer of learning problem is not only important, it's tough. You need a number of mechanisms to bring the new learning back into the workplace. Otherwise, it's idle rhetoric that goes nowhere. And then we have 20 years of quick fixes that, again, leave the organization where it was 20 years ago. So the culture gap is important. The sanctioning system is important. The progress reports are important. And we use every mechanisms we can to transfer the learning from a safe workshop, whether it's culture or skills building, into the workplace.
I love what you said about there has to be a consequence for change, basically. And we always say is pain and pleasure. People do not change unless there's something that helps create that, because we go to the path of least resistance. And when all of a sudden you set the standard and we've agreed on the standard, and all of a sudden you don't abide by it, some kind of pressure, some kind of consequence helps just rock them up. Like, I don't want that. And there's your group.
Yeah. And not only do we have negative consequences, you certainly can use positive consequences. Like you may have a fund. Every time you violate a norm, you got to put $10 into a pot. And eventually, when someone does something well with the new culture, that person gets spoiled with a dinner or a prize or something. So you can use positive as well as negative reinforcement. But you got to do something. Otherwise, nothing changes.
You know, we do the online summit classes, and we were asking a group what the consequence should be if they were late, which we do in every class. And they started throwing out, oh, shave his eyebrows and we'll have to shave their head. I'm like, what? Missing the mark a little bit, a little less dramatic.
Well, that's
I
why
actually did have someone shave their beard.
Well, that's why I say make it legal and ethical. We're not trying to hurt people, but we're trying to make the point that we've got to change if we want to improve.
Yeah. Well, you know, Eric couldn't be here today because he's traveling, but he did send a couple questions I want to ask. Just one big one on his behalf. since we have you here, and it's kind of a large one, but it is: what do you hope your work will accomplish? In other words, what is your hope of legacy through all the work that you've done over the years with conflict?
Yeah, Eric would ask me that question.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of legacy, I would say, again, in the early 70s, when I was starting my PhD program at UCLA, I was just a young kid. I had dreams of having an impact in the research world. I wasn't yet thinking about practitioners and changing organizations. I was just a pure researcher. But as I went to the University of Pittsburgh in the early 70s and began my career there, I started working with other professors who did consulting. I had never thought about doing consulting. It's not why I got a PhD. But I said, sure, let me go along and see what you do. And I found it so interesting that you could take these concepts and apply them in the workplace and see a difference. So that really intrigued me. So as a result, I said, besides coming up with good research and theories and methods, I would like to have an impact in the real world, in the workplace, where it really, really counts long term. So my whole concept of my career path, I think, ultimately changed. And my work started focusing more on making a difference out there in organizations and not just in research journals and getting more and more publications. So I started writing more practical pieces. I started writing to practitioners. I started writing some articles that were appeared in newspapers and magazines. So I made the switch from research journals into the journals that practitioners and managers would read. So when I think now about my legacy, the bigger issue for me is not the research impact, it's the practitioner impact. I get the most satisfaction when I hear that someone has taken one of my models, one of my theories, and done something to improve their life and the lives of others. Oh my goodness, that just gives me the ultimate joy. As some people have said, it's not income, it's impact. And so that is the legacy of what I'm leaving behind. And you may not know this, but my big book is like 600 plus pages that I published in 2021 called Creating a Quantum Organization. I actually labeled that on the book cover as my legacy book because that integrated everything I had done on change management and conflict management and wove it together. And I didn't think I was going to write another book after that. It turned out I did, but famous last words.
Yeah.
And now I'm saying I'm not going to write another book. Nobody believes me. Nobody believes me.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But the legacy is really the impact on people's lives where it really matters and not just research journals.
Well, and one day, I mean, I don't know if you actually know, you probably don't, because we never know the impact that we make. Your work, the people that we get to impact, the people that come to us, your work has impacted people in ways that would blow your mind. Personal, with their spouses, their children, work, like absolute change.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. That gives me a lot of joy, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up here, I have my own question, and it's slightly selfish for the company, but I know you and Mary and Eric's relationship as of 2018 fairly new, and you've driven the responsibility of being able to teach your work directly in our conflict classes and through all the other trainings that we do. Whenever you met Mary and Eric, why did you instill that trust in them? What's it about Driven that you decided to put your faith in and allow us to continue that legacy for you?
Interesting question. Well, first, as Mary suggested in her intro, we first met in Victoria, Canada, in a beta workshop. I think it was a 2-day workshop, something like that.
Yeah.
And I sat at the front table because I was not presenting. The main person was a person I was working with. And Mary and Amber turned out to be sitting in that round table in the front too. And just based on the questions they asked, their interest, their enthusiasm, you could tell they were both very serious learners. And I also got a sense they're also very, very good people. And then we had further conversation. I remember I actually went, if you remember, Mary, I went to see one of your presentations in Orange County. And I was so pleased. I mean, she was so genuine, so engaged. The people took to her. I just sat and just admired it all. And same thing with Eric. When I met Eric, and they both came to Camelot to spend some time with me. And I think the bottom line is genuine people who really care about making a difference, are very professional in how they approach things. They smile a lot, okay, and they're just warm to people, and it's an intuition, it's a good feeling. So I felt very, very, very comfortable with working with them, and we share a lot of the same values on how we conduct ourselves with clients and professionals. So that's in alignment because I have a reputation, so I want to make sure the people who represent me also represent me in the way that's important to me. Okay.
Absolutely.
And they do that very well. They excel. So it was an easy decision.
Yeah.
Well, you're not making me blush. You're making me cry.
Well, I've only been with Driven for a little bit now, but I can say even just in the trainings and reading the small bit of your work, I know it's a huge honor to be able to continue your legacy and to teach your concepts. Because like Mary said, the impact when people hear this stuff for the first time is just like, unlocking a new level of what they can do personally and professionally.
Sometimes I have people who will forgive people. Like literally they're in the class and we're going through the different modes and behaviors and choices and creating the internal first, right? And all of a sudden I'll have people start crying and they realize that I've been hanging on to something and I just need to let go. Yeah. And it is like, it happens so many times. It's just crazy.
Yeah. That's why we do the work we do. Nothing I enjoy more than seeing a person getting an insight, doing something with it, and improving their happiness and their health. That's pure joy. That's just pure joy. We're here to evolve. We're here to grow. We're here to love one another. So let's help people do that.
Yeah. I'm just so honored to have you in our life. I say that all the time. And from the bottom of my heart, just Ralph, thank you for believing in us, for trusting us with your work, and for being a friend, a mentor, a teacher that you come alongside, and to be able to do this podcast and that you get to touch our people. I'm just excited to share you with the world.
Well, thank you so much for being who you are and carrying forth my legacy. That is fantastic. It gives me so much pleasure and joy. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for listening, everybody. We cannot express enough how much we enjoyed having Dr. Kilmann on the show and how much we appreciate him coming on to talk about his work and his life within conflict. Hopefully that was just as impactful for you as it was for me, even in the moment, being able to listen to him talk about all this stuff directly from the source is how I took it. So we'd love for you to get in contact with us about the impact of these conflict episodes. Conflict is one of those things that we are so passionate about because we have seen the change that companies go through when they really lean into being conflict effective and not just attempting to resolve conflict in their companies. So you can email us at podcast@drivenleadership.com to find out more about how you can book a training, do an online session. We have so many options on how to become conflict effective for yourself individually or for your whole team. So once again, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you in the episode next week.